Hey, peace and blessings to you. My name is Jerry B. I am the EntreMusician, and so are you. I am so absolutely delighted about today's show. We're going to go in deep because I have on none other than Tony Michaelides, who's a music industry insider, rock and roll storyteller, author, podcaster, and radio host. He's a former record promoter and publicist who has worked with none other than the iconic U2, Peter Gabriel, Genesis, David Bowie, The Police, Tom Petty, Bob Marley, Whitney Houston, REM. I don't know where it stops. I mean, his career has expanded 5 decades with no signs of slowing down as he continues to write and speak on the history, resilience, and future of rock and roll. You should avail yourself to the books that Tony has. I'm telling you, Moments That Rock, the Insights Collection, and listen to his stories on lessons learned from rock and roll. It is my pleasure to introduce Tony Michaelides. Brother, blessings to you, man.
And you, sir. Nice to be here, Jerry. I must take the opportunity to say that I'm deeply touched. Not because of the artist, but because you got my name pronounced correctly.
Well, I have an incredible
so many people
last
have to
name.
Start again, you know. No, Michaelides is great. Not that I actually asked my mother when she gave birth. By the way, how do you pronounce my surname? But there we go.
Well, I tell you what, I have an incredible last name, so I just shorten it to B. So, you know.
Should be Tony M, that'll work. I did have a Tony the Greek pseudonym when I was doing my radio show back in the UK in the 80s and 90s. And it was given to me by Kid Creole, but he had a nickname for everybody. You know, he had a girl that used to drive me around. She was Tracy Transport. Right. Because he couldn't say Michaelides, I ended up with Tony the Greek, which kind of sounds like I got a dodgy cafe full of mafiosa characters, you know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I am so grateful, man, that you are able to come on to the show with us. And I have a lot of great questions. First of all, you have a very storied career. I really do love the material that you have online. Loved your website and all of the media that's on it. But I figured I would start off by asking you this question because anybody, any indie artist can go to YouTube, or they could go to Google and they can type in record promoter. Okay, this is what a record promoter does, but you have done it. So to you, your definition of the responsibility of a record promoter who works for superstars, how would you define it?
Today or then?
I would say let's go with then, but do you think record promotion is relevant now with all of the streaming, especially as far as major labels are concerned?
Well, I'll be honest with you, Jared, because I don't want to put down on things in any way. I always try and maintain positivity, you know. But I came from a generation of people that made it up as we went along. There were no music schools, you know. I mean, I've just been writing a piece for a talk that I'm doing, you know, and I'm saying things like there aren't no two bands that are alike. There are no two labels that are alike. There are no two managers that are alike. It's not a how to do business, you know. If you've got a problem with your bathroom, get a plumber. You know, you're car doing, get a car mechanic. But this isn't a how to do business, you know. And like I said, I applied for a job in 1974, which I wasn't qualified for because nobody comes to careers. No careers officers come to school and talk to you about a career in music. Yeah. They tell you how to be a bank manager or a lawyer or proper jobs, you know. But I applied for this job for £25 a week, selling folk and jazz out the back of a van. I knew nothing about folk and jazz. I was buying, you know, Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin albums in my teens, you know, and I was 20 years old. But, you know, I thought, well, I don't have a job in the music business. If I don't get it, I still don't have a job in the music business. And, of course, it went on to change my life because, you know, I said to you before we started rolling the tape, Jerry, that kind of like, you know, I kind of feel like I'm on a mission to help keep the legacy alive of some of the greatest artists that ever lived. Yes. But getting back to your question about promotion, it's funny because I started in sales for 4 years and then I went to work for Island Records, my all-time favorite record label. So I was working with Bob Marley and the Wailers and Third World, and they hadn't signed U2 then, but Steve Winwood. I'd been buying Traffic records in the 60s. Now I'm getting them all for free and they're paying me. I mean, how weird is that, you know? And then like Robert Palmer, Grace Jones, you know. So that was kind of a great education. And then I started with Genesis and Peter Gabriel, just in that 1980s period before I went back to Ireland. So I was very fortunate in as much as I can safely say in all my career in the music industry, I never had to make a phone call from work, because it was one of those businesses where here's a record. If you get it played, you still have a job. If you don't get it played, you don't have a job. So, but I went out every single day to prove to that person that gave me that opportunity that it was the best decision he ever made, giving me a job. So I was like fever pitch with excitement. And I always say that they call it record pluggers in the UK. It's kind of PR here, but PR in England drifts more towards press.
I see.
But the thing is that it was like people didn't play their records because they liked me, Joe. They listened to them because they respected me. My job was to feed the information back to artists. And just to make the comparison nowadays, people say to me, do you miss it? I said, well, what is there to miss? My job doesn't exist. I had a staff of 8 to 10 people over a 25-year period, and, on a Friday, we'd be phoning every radio station and getting in the information, seeing what was on the playlists, putting that and faxing it. We never left work until we faxed it to everybody whose records we were working, And nowadays, the thought of going in and just downloading a load of playlists and text people like, what do you think of this?
Yeah.
Because I think that, I mentioned to you before about, this is about building relationships, because you have to get to these people because they're the conduit between the artist and the record label. And I always got excited when I heard a record I was promoting on the radio.
Yeah.
And I used to turn it up, and it wasn't like an ego thing. It was just like,
Exactly.
And, and especially when, listen, let's be honest, Bob Marley, David Bowie, the Police, they'd all be fine without me, They were all established artists. I came in later on in the day.
I see.
But to watch a band like U2 grow from its infancy, getting them their first radio session, their first TV appearance outside of Ireland, I was learning my trade as they were learning theirs. They were asking questions, and even now to see what they've become, and to understand how they got there. I used to take them, Jed, to every crappy little radio station in the middle of nowhere to get an interview that went out at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. We're not talking to tens of thousands of people, as commercial radio was, don't forget all my career in promotions was in the UK. So you weren't taking them to the equivalent of the Manchesters, the Newcastles, the Glasgows. You were taking them to the smaller stations. And it probably took me a year and a half to get them on the radio. That just wouldn't happen nowadays. You'd be lucky if you got a second single if your first hadn't happened.
Sure.
And the thing I always enjoyed the most about promotion, PR, was the artist development side of things. The watching, it's like watching a flower blossom and grow and seeing, it bloom and what happens to it and things. And also understanding why the ones that fail didn't fail. And I always say to everybody that quite often the biggest artists are the easiest to work with because they don't turn up wasted and are obnoxious and full of egos and stuff. They surround themselves with teens. And I have this little brand myself, this Lessons Learned from Rock and Roll, which I find is inspirational to artists on the way up. I mean, I'll give you one little analogy, because, I say to people, why they call Bruce Springsteen the boss? He's had the same staff for 50 years. The only two that have left him have died. Right, so tell me, Mr. Game Developer, Mr. New Rock Star, why couldn't you leave your job every 2 years to double your salary? Do you not think these guys in the East Street Band could get a job anywhere? But no, they stay with him. And I think it's a great lesson for corporate America in staff retention, in as much as because he came in a real, and he's a classic case study of being normal, but being a legend, know. Yes. And I don't know if you've seen that interview with Howard Stern with him, but it's worth watching. The guy stayed with him for 2.5 hours and just connected with him. And Howard Stern, who's a legend himself, for God's sake. He's been around forever, and he's obviously the first kind of shock jock.
Certainly.
But he got everything out of him because he made him feel comfortable. And he let Bruce just feel relaxed, because the thing is with artists like that, he'd probably rather talk about his daughter's, Olympics horse riding career than his new album and things, because he's a normal guy.
Certainly.
He's not one of those guys that thinks like he's bigger than us, or anything, just because he's like hugely successful.
Sure.
And, the thing is with promotions, and radio had a huge impact because I grew up on the pirates in England. They were out the boats in the ocean, and they were playing the Tyrannosaurus Rexes and the David Bowies and the Led Zeppelins in the early days. And of course, like Big Brother, the BBC, they closed them down. Exactly the same as the record industry with Napster.
Yes.
And that's why I'm here, because the music business was kind of falling apart around me in a way, and I hadn't done anything wrong. But my overhead was 10 grand a month. And it was never going to be like that. But subliminally, now that I've been here and I'm an American citizen, it's kind of like nothing lasts forever. If you're a footballer and you're in your 40s and your knees are going, you're never going to play at that level.
Correct.
And I kind of wanted to, it sounds pretentious, but kind of leave my legacy in place. Having worked with some great artists, I didn't want to lay everybody off, work from the bottom of my head, bottom of my bed with a mobile phone.
Right.
Just for like what people could afford, because the record industry brought everything in house. But the irony of that was saving them money on the one hand, but they replaced me, or should I say my company, with one person behind a desk in London, covering everything outside of London. Now we're talking 4 countries, England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales. And it took them a year to replace us because nobody wanted the job.
Wow.
Because we could have... It was with BMG at the end. We could have represented that label. I could have had an office open in Manchester, a promotion tour in Scotland, one in the Midlands, and I could have been at a meeting in London with executives about up-and-coming releases. You can't do that with one person. They don't know the people. They just find out their name. They've got who to call and this and that. And that's what I mean about the essence of relationships. We connected. You found mutual friend connected us. We reached out. Yeah, let's go for it. Let's do it. Absolutely. And with what you're doing, that's why I always make myself available. Yeah, I've got a book out. I'm not saying to people buy it. I'm turning up and making people aware that I've got a book out.
Exactly.
So yeah, if people like what you hear and they're curious and they go and check it out, that's great. But what I like to do first and foremost is give back, because people need the stories behind the event, so to speak, and you can't just talk about it unless you've been there and done it. So
absolutely,
I'm proud to. I said to you before, I don't think it's until it all stops that you really start to appreciate it. But coming through that period, and watching this happen, and it's like the heads of music. I used to have a thing. I used to have like what I called like media tastemakers. So I remember getting like Nena Cherry Buffalo Stance many years ago, new artist. Credible, but nobody really heard of her, with Buffalo Stance, which kind of great. Got what they called white labels in those days. Yeah. So I would send it to like 6 of the tastemakers that I thought that were significant heads of music, because a lot of radio nowadays plays safe. They play hits,
right.
But somebody always has
a chance.
No, because they've got to satisfy advertisers. Right. It's not about satisfying the label. It's about satisfying somebody who's spending X amount of money. So they kind of play records between the ads. Do you know what I mean? Which is okay if you're going shopping, right. If it's in the background. But it's not okay if you want to kind of, take it all in. So
that's right.
There's great radio shows, but they're stuck out on the internet in the middle of nowhere, I do one myself, for a friend who's got a station. And, I still like searching around and finding talent, because nowadays you have the advantage of, well, if you like this, you might like that,
Correct.
So it kind of connects you to certain things. But I do think that certainly there were some great people out in promotions and in America, but there was always that kind of scandal, with the payola and the kind of, the independents. And if there's an amazing book called The Hitmen.
Oh yeah, love it. Love that book.
Oh my God! If you want to know about, because these guys had like minders.
Yes.
Get a guy with a cigar getting out of a car. He's like this big, and he controls that market. And if you've read the book, Jerry, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
The classic example is when the Pink Floyd's manager, with money, they decided not to use independents. And all of a sudden, the Pink Floyd didn't go on the radio in these markets.
Yeah.
And nobody could understand it. They were an established band.
Right.
And they relented eventually after 6 weeks and brought an independent in, one of the key figures who were more kind of mafioso than industry people.
Exactly.
And all of a sudden, that same record that they'd been having over the weeks mysteriously appeared on playlists, which is a shame because, you see, you'll always find in an industry that attracts a lot of money, it doesn't always attract the right people, you know.
That is correct. That is correct.
But I used to enjoy having conversations with people that even if people would, sometimes contractually you were doing the odd record that, was part of the label but you wouldn't have chosen. I get people phoning up and saying, "Why are you doing this, Tony?" Almost like concern for me.
Yes.
And because I used to pride myself on putting our sticker on those labels. But to be able to get through to those people who all went on to incredibly successful careers. I mean, I have researchers at Granada TV. Granada was the first TV station, first TV appearances, the Beatles, Blondie, Elvis Costello, the Stone Roses, all those type of bands, because they took chances.
Yeah.
And they put them on TV rather than the established artists. And these are people I haven't seen for 30 years. And I reconnected with one in the UK, in California. She was a researcher. She was learning her trade when I was learning mine, booking bands for the local TV. She's the executive producer of American Idol and America's Got Talent, Yeah. Another guy went on to start Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, creatives with the rose. But you get that area now where it's almost like, and I don't want it to sound like it applies to everybody, but too many people just want fame and attention. And we live in an age of reality TV. Correct. And we live in an age of low attention span.
Correct.
So like a view on YouTube, Jet, is like 3 seconds. Well, correct. You're not really going to get the essence of a song in that. But, otherwise it's like swipe and go to somewhere else.
That's correct.
And again, I don't want to sound like this boring old man, but, the thought of people listening to my music on a phone would freak me out. But I used to have to get up and turn a record over in my day.
Right. Well, let me ask you this.
Sorry, that was I hope I got a bit of the answer in.
No, that was the opening monologue that you did right there. But you set me up for so many different questions because first of all, you alluded to seeing you two and starting out with them early on in their career when they were just playing pubs and getting them the Tuesday night radio interviews. How does the record promoter work so well with the manager? I mean, is there a plan? Is there a strategy?
Well, that's a really good. That's a great question. I tell you, because the thing is, I always like to meet the manager wherever possible because you have two types of managers, and that's why if people kind of sometimes they think they need a manager nowadays. There's two kinds of managers. There's the drummer's brother who's not good enough to get in the band. But he wants to be in the music business.
Of course.
Well, that's not a great idea. And you get the other one who has the connections, who can make the calls and get the phone picked up at the other end. But even somebody like Paul McGuinness, who managed U2 right up until 5 years ago when he was in his 70s and retired, but he'd been there since 1978. So, he paid his dues. But the thing is, he also managed Polly Harvey and the Pretenders for a while. But you can't take your eye off a ball that's as big as U2.
Yeah.
To focus on nurturing and building the careers of other artists, you would probably have to have a management company. Correct. And Paul McGuinness and another guy, Michael Littman, they would go out with the George Michaels that they managed and the U2s to every gig, just to make sure that the artist was
well taken
comfortable with the right people around them, right. And the right introductions and stuff. But I forgot your question.
Well. With respect to how the record promoter, and getting the gigs worked, was there a strategy that was laid out? Because earlier you said we were kind of making it up as we went along, but as that artist ascends that ladder, what's the strategy?
Well, the thing is, you would like in the old days. I'm talking like I got into promotions in the late 70s, so I did it all through the 80s and 90s, which was a halcyon period for the music industry, you know, because CDs came in and people were replacing the
Vinyl.
record collections,
Yeah.
you know, the vinyl and everything and things like that. So there's a guy called Ray Cooper who gave my first job, who I worked with for many years at different labels. You know, he started Circa Records with Massive Attack and then Chariot as a subsidiary of Virgin. Then he went on, you know, he was the marketing manager for the Spice Girls. So he ended up as like the president of the record company in the UK, and then they shunted him over to do the same job in California with the Spice Girls, make them like the phenomenon that they were, you know.
Sure.
But Ray used to like, he'd send me like a tape of something, and then we would sit down as a team and listen to it, and we would put together like a proposal, you know. So they've got, in those days, you'd have like 1, 2, maybe 3 singles and then launch the album, you know. So you would get, it was always different in the States, because I remember when I worked with Matchbox 20 and, you know, a real big management company, Lippman Entertainment. And I remember when their first single came out, 3 a.m., you know, they released those singles to radio. So basically you release 3 singles to radio that stay on for a period of like 3 months, you know, on rotation, like lots of times on major stations.
Correct.
Top 40 radio and things. But they didn't release an album. They sold 3 million albums of servicing 3 singles or 3 songs to radio, which is incredible, because you don't make any money from selling the singles. And I mean, that's what kind of happened when Steve Jobs came in with what at the time was a really good idea. But he wanted to sell songs.
Yes.
And the industry, being as arrogant as they were, was like, oh, don't make any money. We'll close them down. They'll go away. Not thinking something else would have come along. Now, I'll tell you, to this day, if David Bowie had been running a record company, that wouldn't have happened. He'd have been the guy to say, let's have lunch and sit down and talk about it, you know, because it changed everything. Because in my own, well, not my own defense, but in my own kind of like, you know, admiration of myself, if you like, I did my Ziggy Stardust. I came out to reinvent myself, thinking, well, I don't want to be a part of where this is going. You know, hey, they like the English accent, I might do a Ford commercial. You know, they call it like, I mean, what's more kind of entrepreneurial than emigrating? Most people don't do it. Sure. And if you do it, you only ever do it once. I call it flying by the seat of my pants. You know, it's kind of a little different. But the interesting thing was that, you know, getting back to what you were saying, Joe, was you would nurture and develop, you know, and there was always a time to do it. So you would have to get a manager, and you get second sight in a way of who's going to be able to do, because they've got to be as good at what they do as hopefully you do with you, because it's a team.
Correct.
You know, they build up, in those days, they would build up, you know, a bit of a buzz through the press.
Correct.
You'd service a record to radio at the right time. But also, I always prided myself on being truthful, you know, with what's happening. If you couldn't get, I said to Matchbox 20's manager, real big player, he came from Variety in the 50s. I said to him, the first thing I said to him with Matchbox 20 was, Michael, if we can't get arrested with this record, you'll be the first to know. There's no point in me pampering, say, oh, we're getting there, you know, and then every week there's no airplay. And well, you know, it's like, and you're just trying to worry about your job. I never worried about that. I worried about being right in people's faces. And if they did anything, you know, inappropriately that I didn't agree with, I'd stand up to them. I'd be the tough little northern kid then, you know. Right. It's like, you know, because, you know, a lot of the time some people have one hit and they kind of lose the plot, you know. And I always thought it would be really handy if you were like a psychologist to work in the music business, you know, because you're working with, I don't want to be rude, but a lot of musicians, whether they're up there or down there, they're needy, insecure, you know, it's gonna, they feel someone's out to rip them off. So you instill a bit of trust in them. So I like to feel that, you know, if I suggested they do something, that if I thought it was worth doing. And the classic case study was right 20 years into my career when I was on the road with David Bowie. He was an 18-year-old kid, right, who watched David Bowie split the Spiders from Mars in front of me. Yeah. And I was so mad with him. Wow. It was like, how could you do this to me? Where's my next David Bowie record going to come from? And then 25 years later, I'm sitting down having my dinner with him and, you know, and discussing the promotion that's available, you know. And my story is working with people whose records I bought as a kid. I mean, that still sends shivers up my back, you know.
Sure.
But the thing with Bowie, just to go back to what you were saying then, Joe, was the who doesn't want to interview David Bowie? Who doesn't want to write about David Bowie? He's a superstar, you know. So we'd sit down and I used to go out every morning because he liked to read the reviews of the paper, not to make him feel good, just to see what people thought of the next phase of his career and things. So I'd sit down, and I remember vividly this thing in Bowie did a small venues. He was doing large festivals in Europe, but he was playing to like 800-900 people.
Wow.
Which is great because you can see the whites on people's eyes and things like that, you know. Yeah. And we'd sit down, and he said, "What's on offer, Tony?" And I said, "Well, you know," I said, "There's this guy from the BBC, you know, he's got all your records. He's a big fan, David. You know, he wants to, you know, do an interview with you." I said, "The other guys, the commercial station, what was ITV in the UK?" I said, "Hey, listen, you're a famous artist. You know, they played a bit of the video. The gig sold out. They play a bit of the video. They mention the gig. They get on to feature on Cookery or something, you know, whatever." And he said, "What do you think?" I said, "Listen, it's entirely up to you. It doesn't matter if you do them or not do them, you know." And he looked at me, and I could still see it in his eyes now. And he leaned across the table. He said, "Well, what do you think?" I said, "Well, to be honest, David, if I was going to do one of them, I'd do the guy from the BBC. He's you know, he's a big fan." He looked at me and he said, "If you think I should do it, Tony, I'll do it." I swear to this day, I walked out of that dressing room. He had a man on the road, so I was respectful of his downtime, you know.
Absolutely.
And I walked out down the corridor and I was clenching my fists. I don't believe this. David Bowie has agreed to do something on my recommendation. I felt so proud. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it was the truth. I mean, why not talk to a guy who's honoured to talk to you and he's going to ask you probably better questions and make you feel better about an interview? He was doing station idents for radio stations in Japan and stuff. Nothing was too much, you know.
Wow.
He was just the most amazing, visionary, incredible person to work with. Wow. And I found myself listening to David Bowie cassettes in the car driving between gigs. He had that much of an impact on me. Amazing. Because he was the real deal.
Yeah.
And
that's a question that brings to mind as far as the music industry today, or I should say the artists in the music industry today, and those of that era who are legendary. The issue of longevity, is it because of their humility and their willingness to do all kinds of things, listening to those who are around them instead of saying, "I'm the star, I'm going to do it my way, and you guys shut up," you know, and listen?
That's a really good question, because strangely enough, I go for my morning walks here, you know, with it being a little less humid in Florida, and Bono's gone out promoting his Surrender, his book, you know, done a lot of interviews with a lot of people, and I've been listening to him, you know.
Yeah.
And he talks about a lot of the old days, you know, so for me it's great, you know, content for me to put into my world type thing. I know a lot of it, and I remember him saying that, because there was U2, nobody wanted to sign U2, and Bono and his I've actually got a photograph of them in my book, you know, stood on my doorstep.
Wow.
Which was quite strange because the house number I lived at was 61, and the Edge had just turned 61. And you seem to forget, as you're getting older, everybody else is getting older with you. It's not just you.
Correct.
So, like, and the tour manager's there, Dennis Sheehan, who sadly passed away, he's there. And my daughter is cradled in his arms on the front step. And Bono and Alison were just dating then. They weren't even married. And I said, "Oh, by the way, the little girl at the front is my daughter. She turned 40 last month." You know? And I always say this to like, you know, and this is kind of like, I suppose it's the hopeless romantic in me. It's the wow factor, in as much as for most people that are running companies in corporate America or whatever, Jerry, that U2 have always been famous. You can't relate. I have a bit in my talk where I say, have you ever seen a band you love play to a sellout crowd and wondered about a time when there were nothing? And then I recite the story about seeing them play to 11 people and seeing that, like, you know, the way they kind of, you can't forget you saw that band. Listen, they weren't great musicians. His voice was all over the place, but they wanted you to leave that night remembering the name of the band and maybe one or two of the guys in the band, you know.
Yes.
And that's that kind of passionate. You know, the interesting thing with you two was like, you know, both Bono and Larry lost their mothers when they were like 14.
I see.
So, and I heard Bono talk about that, you know, back in the day. It was like, it wasn't a case of wanting to do it. They had to do it. So instead of being those kids that went to school and it's like, why have you got a mother and I haven't? And being angry kids, you know, and going the other way.
Yeah.
It was like music was the kind of a relative,
The therapy.
you know. Absolutely. And clearly it worked, you know. But when he was talking about, when he came over, you two played something like 12 London shows in 14 days. You know, you won't know them, the Hope and Anchors and things like that, the Marquee, you know, classic little places to go and play, you know, maybe it's 30 people, 40 people. And if you get 100, it's a result, you know, and everything.
Night, yeah.
And I remember, and this was I just heard it 3 days ago, and Paul McGuinness had come in to manage them. And Bono decided to get on a plane himself with his girlfriend, then Alison, and hawk his way around every record company with his cassette of the band, and got rejected. And he's reciting this himself, and he's saying to Paul McGuinness, I'm going to go. He said, it's not the time, Bono. He said, no, I'm going to do it. He said, I'm telling you, it's not the right time. This is Paul McGuinness, the manager. And Bono's saying this, and then he said, so I went and I did it, and we didn't get anywhere. And I came back, and Paul was right. It wasn't the right time. So he admitted it. Yes. But on the other hand, he still wanted to prove to himself. Yes. But then, in a way, that's an endorsement of you've got the right guy managing you, because he was right and you were wrong. But you admit to being wrong. Excellent. But maybe instead of having a non-stop battle with it.
Yeah.
And that's why I think you have these stories about Brian Epstein being the fifth member of the Beatles and things like that. You know, I was party to that in the UK with New Order. Their manager was every bit as much as a part of the band than the guys. It's just that they didn't play anything. But a lot of the decision making, when you have the confidence in the guy that is the conduit between the record company and the the record company, the act, you really have to be looking like you're on your game and you know what you're talking about. I must tell you one little story that's hilarious, though. I remember interviewing a guy called Dennis McNally, who was the tour manager for the Grateful Dead. Well, the publisher for the Grateful Dead. He'd written a book on Jack Kerouac that Jerry Garcia had bought, and he ended up employing him to be their publicist. He told me this great story about musicians. He said musicians have a habit of remembering the last thing somebody said to them. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, it's like this. He said, so you've got like this guy with hair down here, and he's in the back of the cab and he's talking to the cab driver. You know, the cab driver's a Rasta, you know, or something like that. He's into his reggae, you know, and he's talking about Marley and Toots and the Maytals and all that and everything. And then he gets out of the cab and he goes to a meeting, right, you know, the record company. And during the course of the meeting, he says, I think we should make a reggae record. And it's like, what the... You know, where did that come from? And it came from just a conversation with a cab driver who happened to be into reggae. No, you're a lead singer in a rock metal band. We're not making a reggae record. I love it.
That's hilarious.
There's a certain amount of truth to it, because I've kind of seen them, you know. But there's a great quote from a guy called Doc McGee, who managed Kiss, Bon Jovi, Motley Crue. I mean, managing Motley Crue, not easy. Right. And he has this quote: less than 90% of rock stars have less than a high school education. They wave their hand in one direction and 50,000 people wave their hand in the same direction, and they feel power.
That's true.
And these are the guys that get back to the hotel and they've been adored by a crowd. Right. And they can't get a steak sandwich at 4 a.m. and they go berserk and they throw TVs out.
Right.
Maybe I'll get him a steak sandwich. These people love me, you know. And that's the thing. And I interviewed, sadly he passed away a year ago, a guy called Richard Cole, who was Led Zeppelin's tour manager, right, forever. Well, Led Zeppelin, they wrote the book. They invented sex, drugs, and rock and roll, for God's sake.
Certainly.
And he said to me, you know, he said, he always made a point, because quite often the band would check in after the show. And you get those situations where they've booked 10 rooms and they've only got 9. So he would never let the band check in. He would always go to the desk himself and he said, you know, give him the name. He said, we've got 12 rooms booked for tonight. And he says, oh, there's only 11 down here. And he'd lean over and go, it would be in your best interest to find us another. Because if you let the drummer go up like Bonzo or somebody and tell him he's got no room, he would go berserk.
Oh my God.
And the other thing with Zeppelin, and they kind of, like I say, wrote the book in their era, they would never go on stage until this hasn't got anything to do with anything really, but they would never go on stage without getting paid in cash up front. And they used to go backstage to get the money. And the promoter would open the drawer and there'd be a wad of cash and a gun.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I've played some gigs like that. I mean that.
Yeah. Well, there you go. But Peter Grant, who came from a wrestling promoter type thing, never had a contract with Led Zeppelin. It was just word of mouth. But if you were trying to sell bootlegs and take money away from his band, he'd hang you over a balcony. You're not doing this. And he'd go berserk with people. Totally protective towards the artists. And when Bonzo died, that's what I love about a band like that. When the drummer died, they were over. Yeah. And he went into a lot of depression, because, that was his life. And now a quarter of it had gone. And the only thing they reformed for was the Ahmed Ertegun Foundation when Ahmed Ertegun died. Yeah. Yeah. But you see, that again is sad, but amazing. He died at a Rolling Stones gig. Yeah. He died doing his job. A Turkish immigrant who told Crosby, Stills and Nash they should talk to this guy and introduce him to Neil Young. He signed Led Zeppelin within 15 minutes of meeting him.
Well, he was a great record man. I mean,
incredible.
New talent, and he just had the ear. I mean, from Led Zeppelin.
And the artists loved him.
Absolutely. Now that's a question that I wanted to ask because there's been so many documentaries and so much talk, even from quote unquote stars, about the evils of the record company and taking their royalties and taking advantage of them and all of that. But you had said in one interview I heard your fondness for Island Records, and not just because they hired you, but Island Records seemed to me from conversations I've heard you in is that was a record company that really loved their artists. I mean, there was a synchronicity amongst them and their artists. Is that true, or is there other labels that? Totally.
I mean, when you think, I can't do an interview without mentioning them because, like I said, these were records that I'd bought as a kid, and I'd bought Traffic albums, got into Steve Winwood and stuff and things, but Chris Blackwell used to sign, and he's the first to admit, when he first heard U2, he thought they were a little tinny, and didn't quite like them. But he didn't go over his A&R department and say, "You're not signing them, this is my money." He let them do it. And then when he met them, he could see the potential in them. And all he could do as the head of the record company was allow the tour support and stuff to help him get to where everybody hopes to go, but not everybody does. Gotcha. And that was really interesting. But the other thing with Ireland was, and I read this isn't my own experience, but after reading it, it is, if that makes sense. He used to sign people, because of who they were, not because of just talent. Because you don't want to work with some jerk, who's going to turn up late and waste it. And that's what I said to you before about the biggest artists are usually the easiest to work with because they're professionals. Correct. And they appreciate it's not all about them. Yes. And I think with Ireland was, we mentioned Ahmed Ertegun, it doesn't stop there. I mean, A&M was Herb Alpert and Jerry Moss, Yes. Chris Blackwell, a white Jamaican, who came to England in a minivan selling reggae records in Ladbroke Grove to dealers and stuff. It was so funny because I just bought his book. And he talks about one shop he used to go to, and the guy used to buy his weed, And Chris used to have his time getting there because if he got there like at 11 o'clock and his dealer came in at 10, he'd spent all his money on buying weed. He didn't have money to buy records. But the thing with the artists that came through, these labels, Jer, were run by record company people. Mm-hmm. They weren't run by accountants and lawyers who had to say, well, we need to put this out in October for market share. It wasn't about that. In the same way that the radio stations would back in the day, and that's why college radio was so big in the day here. Those people get their first chances through there. I mean, it's not any different to, I'm a fan of football, as in football, not as in football. Yes. Football. So you kind of, you you learn from the people around you, you know. And I got to realize that I was surrounded by greatness. So in a way, I had to kind of, you know, like if you go and, well, back in the day, should I say, Manchester United, you know, if you play in that team, you have to play at a certain level. If you don't play, and I always used to find it incredibly stimulating working with great label people and great managers, because you step up and you really, you know, you really have to pull out all the stops, and that's what makes the team effort of something, you know, with you know, such a success. But it was a different time because you had labels that would support an artist, you know, because everybody, you know, wants to be successful.
Correct.
But if you have a label that is prepared to back you, rather than just if they're losing money, drop you. Because, you know, when you re-MI or something in the 60s, you got the Beatles. If everything else fails, it's just a tax loss. You just drop them and they didn't make any money because you're making all this money while you're sleeping with one band.
That's right.
But the biggest bands, in a way, don't kind of, you know, I'm not a great fan of overnight success. You know, you talk about careers, and careers start from the bottom, and there's only one way to go. But at the same time, when you're at the top, there's only one way to go. So you can't rest on your laurels in an industry. You have to make sure that, you know, I mean, even you take a band like U2, when they got with Brian Eno and Daniel Lanois in the 80s, Chris Blackwell didn't think it was a good idea. He said, listen, this guy's great. I've signed him. He makes ambient records. You're a rock group. They'd been making records with Steve Lillywhite. Changed the entire sound, and they made the Unforgettable Fire and the Joshua Tree by taking a creative chance.
Yes.
And they were at a stage where people knew who they were. And then they had things like, look at Live Aid, you know. They didn't even do the only song anybody knew, Pride, you know, in the name of love, because Bono went a walk around and got a girl out of the crowd and was lost in the moment.
Yes.
And it could have destroyed the band, but it turned them into superstars overnight because the audience connected with it.
That's correct.
And that audience is 1.4 billion people.
That's correct. That's correct.
So I admire, you know, I admire artists that you know, step out of their comfort zone, which isn't the right way of describing it, really, because there isn't a comfort zone for them to get in. So they don't have to get out of it. They're always constantly evolving. Yes. And I think that happens in any line of business. Nothing lasts forever. You can sit there and think you've made it, and then all of a sudden you crash and burn. Absolutely. And that's incredibly hard for an artist to deal with because they don't expect it. But quite honestly, they're to blame.
Well, that leads to another question, because you talked about how easy it is to work with those who are at that top echelon because they are professionals. But what are the challenges, conversely, of working with iconic superstars? Are there challenges that come along with it? I mean, I'm sure they show up on time, but what would you say, hey, well, this is a major challenge and you've always had to prepare yourself, whether it was Bowie, whether it was U2, whether it was REM or Whitney Houston or whomever?
What were the challenges? The challenges were that some artists, like I worked with Whitney Houston, but I never met her or done anything with her because she was like protected by Clive Davis, you know, so you couldn't really get to her. And she was a legend and a superstar type thing. So I didn't really learn anything from Whitney Houston. That's not speaking ill of her or anything.
Gotcha.
But the ones that you got an opportunity to work with and grow with were the ones that you learned. But I like to think that you know, you can have conversations with them. And for instance, here's an example that I found kind of firsthand. I mean, you got that situation where, you know, you need to be a people person and understand that these people are human beings, right? So that analogy of paying to like a massive crowd and stuff like that. You take an instance where, say, somebody you've worked with for 5, 6, 7 years and watch them grow, you know, into like a stadium band from kind of, you know, a nightclub band playing like, you know, little dive bars and things. Correct. All of a sudden, they're a little like not quite the same. They look like, you know, they're just about to go and perform and they've got to rise to the occasion. Yeah. And they're a little bit low backstage. Instead of like getting angry with them, you know, it's kind of a case of going up and putting your arm around them and are you okay? Do you know what I mean? Because guess what? That guy might have been on the road playing to 30, 40, 50,000 people a night. He might have been on the road for like 4 years. He's gone to Australia. He's gone to Japan. He's done Europe. He's done the States.
Yes.
And you know what? His wife's had a baby and he'd rather be at home watching a movie and eating pizza than being adored by a load of fans. So you have to be not respectful, but you have to be human in understanding that, you know, success has a lot. It's weird because on the one hand, you know, with rock stars particularly, they spend their entire life wanting to be famous, then they get famous and they spend the rest of their life spend their life wearing sunglasses so nobody can recognize them.
What a dichotomy, right?
Yeah. They're a weird bunch. But I love it when you kind of you know, like I said to you before, you know, you're learning your trade as they're learning theirs, because no two acts are the same.
Sure.
And there's some great stories of people like Bowie. I mean, David Bowie, like, he used to get, and he did this with 9 Inch Nails, and he did it with the Pixies, 2 bands who at that time were really cool and the press loved them and everything. And at that time, David Bowie was in his outside period. He was experimenting drums and bass, whatever, and things, you know, to satisfy his own creative urges.
Correct.
Each of those bands could have blown him off stage, but he invited them on, no buying tour support, you know, to get third on the bill and play half an hour to, you know, well, a lot of people, considering you've still got 30,000 at the bar, they still got like 5,000 at the front of the stage.
That's correct.
But the point is that he would go out every night and watch that band on the side of the stage. Instead of chilling out backstage and waiting for his moment, he'd watch them.
Wow.
And he'd compliment them at the end. You know, could you imagine what an artist like that would feel like
when
you glance to the side and David Bowie is watching you?
That's right.
You know, I mean, you know, just that's what separates people like that. And, you know, and I always say, you know, being a rock star isn't like being adored by fans and selling millions of records. It's making a difference, you know, because again, the hopeless romantic, you know, with music, it's like when you write that song that means that much to that many, you change the world.
That's right. Well, I appreciate you being here with us, man. I mean, this has been really.
Is the time gone already?
Yeah, I tell you what. I tell you what. But here's the thing. I feel, Tony, is the road map, or the on ramp, I should say, to another conversation. I mean, there has to be
my pleasure. Yeah,
you know, because there's so many stories. But before you go, please tell us a little bit about your book, your podcast, and your radio show, because I know people can find you at your website, which we have here, and we'll put links in the show notes.
Thank you
so that they can get to you. But just give us a snippet of when we turn on a book, or if we were to go to Amazon, I mean, if we turn on your podcast, or if we would go to Amazon to get your book, what we can expect to find. I will say one thing. I noticed in your book there was no dumpster diving, man. You know, you're not telling sordid stories. This is not name dropping. You're really behind the scenes. You know, I really appreciated that.
I revisited my book. It's really funny because I don't sing and I don't play, but I think like an artist, right? And I remember Simply Red and Mick Hucknall being the classic example when he signed to Warner's Elektra, and because my friend signed him, and they wanted to put out Holding Back the Years, you know.
Yes. And
of course, it became a #1 record in America, and Mick Hucknall didn't want to release it. He was adamant. He said, "Well, why do you want to release this?" It was he'd written it and played it in his previous band. It was like 4 or 5 years old, but nobody had heard it. But for an artist, I wrote this last night. It's the best thing I ever did. You can't relate to, and it's like, no, nobody's heard this. Correct. And of course, they were right, and he was wrong. And that was the same with me with the book. The pandemic came, Jerry, and I was sat in the patio drinking my coffee, and I revisited my book. And it's like, now it's like, oh, I'm so much better than that. I can write a much better book. So I started to write a book, and I took some of the nuggets out of the first one, you know. And I kind of like realized that there was no end to the book. And it went from me growing up, meeting Led Zeppelin and getting a job in the music industry, into this Lessons Learned from Rock and Roll. Because I called my first book, The Insights Collection, Lessons Learned from Rock and Roll, but people didn't get the engine room.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, well, on the one hand, you've got a tagline of Lessons Learned from Rock and Roll. What is it you don't understand? And the engine room to me was like stoking the fire. You were in the background, not front of stage, but you were providing like that. So I thought it was a good title. So I then split it up, and I'm going to release a series of ebooks and audiobooks on Lessons Learned from Rock and Roll. Like, I have classic case studies, like the one I told you about Springsteen in staff retention, preparing for success. How U2, when they were preparing for the school disco, as like 17-year-old kids, decided to share all the publishing.
Right.
Well, coming from Manchester, which split up the Smiths and the Stone Roses, you don't have that conversation when you break.
Right.
Because it's too late, and it's what makes bands split up. So they're great, like role models, like you were if you were a lawyer. You would have a case study to relate to and things.
That's
and
right.
I think with my, I still have the lessons learned from rock and roll time, but I remember going to a gig when I was living in Tampa in St. Petersburg to like a rehearsal room to see this artist, and there was a sign on the wall that says, it's an Italian poet and playwright called Cesar Pavese, and it just said, "We don't remember days, we remember moments." Right. And it resonated with me, and I thought, wow, I love that.
Good. Yeah.
So I had this moments that rock. So what I do on my podcast, is I invite people to share moments that rock their world.
Yeah.
And my premise is, if they excite me, they will excite others. So I'm bringing people in to share moments out of their career, industry insiders and artists, you know. Absolutely. And I interviewed yesterday or the day before Steve Tanner, who I haven't spoken to for 30 years, and we're doing this. It's like a fireside chat.
Yeah.
And, you know, talking about signing REM, you know, and working with Miles Copeland and the Police and things. So great stories. So that was the kind of premise behind that. And then I do a radio show as well for an internet station, the largest independent internet station in Europe, called Fab Radio International. I enjoy that. I'm doing a lot of things like this where I have a voice, if you like. But yes, of course, I'd like to make a career in speaking and talking because I'm unemployable apart from anything else. And I don't want to, even if I had a load of money, I wouldn't want to like sit and rest on my laurels and end up with dementia and all the horrible things that happen in life. So I really want to try and kind of light the fuse. And, you know, it sounds very cliche, but if I can get off this, if I can get one artist to pick up a David Bowie record out of his grandparents' record collection or something, then, you know, I'm doing my bit. But I'm trying to kind of, I feel it, and it's through moments like this where you have obvious music people, you've just met them, and it's like, I feel like I know you, you know, and we're just comparing notes, and you're asking intelligent questions which will resonate. But I also think that, you know, we're having an audio version and an ebook where the book's like $20, which is pretty cheap, you know, when you think of some books. But the thing is, if I can make a series of lessons, which are like a 20-minute ride to work or something, you know, because audiobooks is the biggest growth area in publishing. It's a drive to work for somebody, or you know, and a student or a musician can afford it and get something out of it. And not necessarily to become that person that I'm talking about, but to just think of different ways to do things. Because there's also the part of me that, you know, certainly in a place like this, and coming from Manchester, which was from Graham Nash and Freddie and the Dreamers to Simply Red to New Order, Joy Division, Oasis, the Stone Roses, the list goes on, you know. But it was a creative city. Like, I got offered a job to move to London, but I said to the guy, why would I travel 200 miles south to travel 400 miles north to do my job? So I kind of, in my own way, kind of invented regional promotions in the regions. It's not rocket science, you know. So I kind of adapted my own, you know, I A&R'd my own company, if you like. You know, I did it my own way. It was right for what we did. I never employed anybody who ever worked for a record company, but I employed people who I thought had that certain something to go out. And I said, listen, I don't want you to be me. I said, two me's would be unbearable. Go out and make it your own. And I give you one piece of advice. Whatever you screw up on, I'll pull you out of. But it empowers them. My intern went on to manage Coldplay. You know, it's incredibly rewarding to feel that you gave people a leg up and you helped them because you knew they had potential. What's the difference between signing an artist because you think there's something there? And that's exactly what happened with U2. They couldn't play very well. Bono couldn't sing. And you kind of, and I remember Dave Grohl's fantastic from the Foo Fighters, you know, when he talks about, he said, you know, we used to rehearse in the garage. We were so bad, you know, we were really crap, you know. And I think that's really inspiring because it makes you feel that, you know, you can get better at this. And the artists that fail, for want of a better word, are when they have a little bit of success and they don't think they have to do anything more. They don't understand that people are coming up behind them who are going to supersede them, jump right ahead and stay there a lot longer because they have a different. You talked about a plan. Yeah. It's a game plan. You sit down and that's my preparing for success. Lesson learned from rock and roll. Get your house in order.
Correct.
Because, once you get to a level where there's interest, a lot of the business side, it's not the time. I mean, I knew a guy managing the Stone Roses, and they had success, but not really because of him, because of their talent.
Yeah.
I didn't want to take him to America until they were as big as the Beatles. I had to tell him he was delusional. That was never going to happen. There's never going to be anybody as big as the Beatles,
Right.
And, the thing is, it's kind of like he got the attorney who done the real estate deal on his house to do his record deal. Wow. They spent the rest of their life trying to get out of that deal. I mean, that all the creative energy goes when you're thinking you're screwed up.
Yeah.
And the vulnerability of young artists to be taken advantage of by people who just want to come in and make a quick buck.
Exactly.
And I like it when, you grow. I mean, Guinness grew with U2, and he was good. He was better at his job to start with than they were at theirs.
Yes.
But as they grew, every single piece of the puzzle was like creative energy. And they agreed to disagree at times and things. When I first met them, they used to, at the end of the show, they used to listen to the gig in the dressing room, just to find out what worked and what was crap. And, hunger for getting to the people, so to speak, because your fans are everything. I mean,
absolutely,
they're the ones that now. But another conversation for another time, Jerry. But the the kind of artist development side of things now. I've got a lot of scenarios and things I can compare how you did artist development then to how you go about doing it now.
Certainly,
because for some it could be overwhelming,
I understand. Well, like I said, you're setting us up real good for part 2, whenever that will be, and I hope it's soon.
And then 3 and 4 and 4,
and then we'll do our own audio session. With me picking your brain, But I truly appreciate you coming on, man. And like I said before,
I really appreciate you inviting me. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it a lot.
Definitely. Well, we will have every way to get in touch with you down in the show notes so people can click right through. And I'm absolutely promising you, guaranteeing you that you are going to love what you read in Tony Michaelides' book, his podcast, his radio show. Will make sure that all of those things are in the show notes so that you can get right to them. This has been a very, very fun interview. I appreciated just listening to all of the stories of these icons that he has worked with. And man, it really does my heart good to know someone who has been that close to the level of genius that Tony has. So hope you enjoyed the show. Tell somebody that you vibe with the EntreMusician. As I always say, tell 4 people you know, tell 6 you don't know. Like, subscribe, and share this video. My name is Jerry B. I am the EntreMusician, but you know what's most important? So are you. We will see you again next week. God bless.